Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is February 1st, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about Part 16, the examination of Job, the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox and King James translation. Now, there are moments when righteousness stands without explanation. No covenant land surrounds it. There's no temple to protect it, and no national promise secures it. Here, a man stands before heaven with nothing but integrity. What remains when blessing is stripped away reveals more than comfort ever could. Now, the accusation against Job is not that he sinned, it is that he worships for reward. Remove protection and devotion will collapse. Well, that is the claim spoken in heaven. And what follows tests not only a human, but the nature of faith itself. Now, suffering does not create instability in God. It exposes instability in perception. When pain arrives, voices multiply. Some defend justice with certainty, and some question in anguish. Some speak in confidence without understanding. And through all of it, God does not just simply disappear. Silence is not absent. Delay is not indifference. Permission is not abandonment. The boundaries of heaven remain even when earth trembles. The trial unfolds within limits that never break. So Job does not receive explanation. He receives scale. The foundations of the earth answer where argument cannot. Creation itself speaks of order that does not waver. And when integrity survives without incentive, worship is then purified. When reverence remains without reward, the accusation fails. So what stands at the end is not a wounded deity, but a restored vision. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Boots Hafner. Boots saying, how's it, Pastor James Carner, voice of the Rumble airwaves and creator of ElitePotion.com. How's it, warrior family? And if we could all hit that like button, that would be great. Yeah, in fact, let's all do it together. Hit the X, then hit thumbs up, and then hit the live chat button, and you don't lose your spot. The more likes I get, the better Rumble creates more opportunity for us. Number two warrior is Scorpion saying, hey, Pastor. Hello, warrior family. Excited about tonight. Great. I am too. Examination of Job between the Ethiopian canon and the King James. And we're going to continue doing this all the way throughout the entire New Testament so we can understand what the Ethiopian canon says versus the King James. Boot says, just hit the X button, then hit the thumbs up. You won't miss a word, which we just did. And Scorpion says, back in the Carner cave. Nice. Yeah, we're back in the Carner cave with the backdrop. It's a lot better than being in the van. That's all I'm saying. All right, we're going to go into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, 5-year-old Liam Canejo Ramos and his father, returned to Minnesota from an ICE facility. Well, it looks like someone's taken a step back in authority under ICE, releasing a few people, I guess. Remember, all of this ICE crap is politics. It has nothing to do with immigration. It has everything to do with keeping us divided and angry at each other, meaning left hates the right and right hates the left, and meh, 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 meh. So we don't see them stealing money from our pockets. That's what it is. Speaker Johnson is moving to end the shutdown by Tuesday. You mean the shutdown's been going on since November? Interesting. For the past couple of weeks, I've been talking about a shutdown and then a partial shutdown. But we've been in a shutdown for a while, haven't we? Oh, God. I didn't get any coffee earlier. I'm sorry. Anyway, look, we need to have discernment here. The government is using the shutdown as a political theater to get us to hate each other. And what we need to understand as Christians is when they start to try and divide and conquer us, we need to take a stand and say, no, I'm going to pray for my neighbors. I'm going to pray for the party that I don't agree with. I'm going to pray for even their leaders. Jesus just gave one commandment above all, just one: love God and love your neighbor. How hard is it for us to love those who we disagree with? Well, apparently it seems to be pretty hard because we're still divided as a nation. But Christians, it's your responsibility to discern the times and stop with the agreeing of hatred that they want you to agree with. That is the stage. Trump says if Iran doesn't agree to a nuclear deal, then we'll find out what happens, whether the U.S. will attack them or not. Well, haven't we already attacked them? And why are we so worried about nuclear weapons? Is this still working? Are people still afraid of nuclear war? I mean, I remember when we were kids, they used to put us under desks and put our heads between our laps, and they told us to not look at the bright light. And they don't practice nuclear drills in school anymore. So why are we worried about nuclear war? If it hasn't happened by now, I doubt it's going to happen entirely. And all of the nuclear weapons that we have, they're all old and ancient. Sure, we've got technology that can move the weapon from A to B. That's more recent, but not the atomic nuclear blow. This is ancient old weaponry. The newest weaponry they've got on us is electromagnetic frequency. We should be more scared of them and their voice of God technology, where they can simply plant thoughts into your mind or talk to you like they are God instead of nuclear war. And don't forget, Iran is divided between Russia and Israel. Iran is being used as a proxy. So Russia can take Iran's oil on the black market, control the northern part of Iran, and Israel control all the commodities part of southern Iran. It's been going on since the 60s. You can do research and you can find that out, that Iran is 2 states. What do I know? I'm just a hick from Oregon. Todd Blanche says review of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking case is over. Finally. But our memories of all the political leaders that are on that list isn't over. I'll never forget it. I know what the CEOs of the too big to fail corporations are all about. That and the political leaders that were selected for office. We know what they're all about. They're a bunch of sickos. Mayor of Portland, Oregon demands ICE leave the city after federal agents gas a few people. I demand you leave. Will they leave? No. But I got to tell you, I was right there during the ICE protests in Portland. And I got to tell you, it was a bunch of furries with keyboards. It wasn't that big of a deal. So it's political. They're using it again to get the left to hate the right. That's all. So they can continue stealing money from you. Have discernment. God wants us to just pray for those who are stealing money from us. The Bible says that their evil will come out and they will get caught. So stop trying to be the judge and jury here. That's not your responsibility. Your job is just to be a human being and love your neighbor. Is that so hard to do? Apparently it is. Bomb cyclone brings bitter cold and snow to the southeast. Well, I missed that by a day. I was in Georgia for a couple hours. It looked cold outside. only at the airport. And then I headed over to Salt Lake City, which I had to run to catch my next flight. That's always fun. I invented a new way of running in an airport, and people saw me and they were laughing, but it worked like a charm. You see, I've got 4 wheels underneath my suitcase, and I just put 2 hands on it and I let my legs go. And dude, I was hauling ass. And I made it. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, stop worrying about the news. If you're a Christian, we're not supposed to worry about this. The news is a bunch of bullshit. They're lying to you and they're stealing from you. That's all it is. That's all it's going to be. So in the meantime, try and love your neighbor, be good to your friends and family, and help out when the need is available. And that's it. All right, when we come back, tonight we're going to be talking about Part 16, the examination of Job, the book of Job, between the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox and the King James Bible.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them. Their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back. Surfer Wife says, "Hey James, how was your vacation? And hey family, what's up guys? And everyone in politics is playing their part. They are, absolutely. Vacation was awesome, Surfer Wife. In fact, it was 85, sometimes 90 and 30% humidity. It was warm, yet not too hot. Was never too cold. And at night, slept without having blankets on, really. In February. Well, actually, end of January. But it's nice to be able to have the freedom to travel to an island, which I went to, Turks and Caicos, which is an island above Haiti, and have the freedom to go there, spend as long as you want. That's what I did. I spent 10 days. And it was a very pleasant time. In fact, as I was telling you guys last night, while I did the show in the van, because our power was out, that time seemed to slow down while I was in Turks and Caicos. And I tried to take naps. I tried to sleep in. Nothing worked. I was just not tired. And so I'm just perplexed as to what changed, because by the time I got home, I was back to tired again and taking long naps and sleeping in, and I just can't seem to wake up. I think it's electromagnetic frequency. I think it has something to do with 5G. Because let me tell you, they had LTE, like 3.0 cell technology, not the 5.0 that we have currently, 5G. They had 3.0. I didn't feel as tired while I was in Turks and Caicos on the island of Provincialis. That's where I stayed. And I got to see all kinds of sea creatures and turtles and flamingos, and it was beautiful. And I also rented a Jeep, and I drove around all the parts of the island as I possibly could. And I still had enough time by the time I got back to the hotel to take a nap, but my body just said no. And some people say, well, it's probably because you're free from any stress. No, that's not it. The thought of my son still weighed over my head. I believe that we are being, I could be wrong, but I believe it because I can feel it by the time I hit America. We're under attack from some type of a technology that makes us whiny, tired, angry, pissed. And I believe it's on purpose. But what do I know? Scorpion says he's just waiting for Godzilla to wake up from his nap at this point. And Boots says, marsupials. All right, guys, tonight we're going to be talking about Job. Job, the book, opens up without any warning and without national framing. There's no king named in Job. There's no covenant crisis being introduced here. A single man is described as blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. And the text establishes alignment before disruption. Now, the first movement is not earthly, but it's heavenly. The adversary questions motive, not morality. The accusation, the devil accusing Job, is very precise. Remove the hedge and worship will fail. Devotion, the devil claims, is sustained by protection. Now, if you really want to understand the book of Job, we did a full show on it. And you could go back to my website, jamescarner.com, and go to the search area and just type in the book of Job. And you will see a killer show about Job and how the devil was being tested at this time. The test wasn't for Job. It was for the devil. And what he did was he destroyed everything but Job. But God didn't say, hey, go ahead and destroy Job's family. God just said, hey, don't lay a finger on his head. And the devil's like, well, okay, well, you didn't say anything about his family. So this was the devil's chance to reign on earth and be a good king. But instead, he showed his true colors and destroyed not only just Job's family, but destroyed his businesses, his agriculture, his cows, his everything. And in the wake was just one man with nothing. But tonight, it's not just about that. Tonight, we're examining the difference between the Ethiopian canon and the King James Bible. And as we've been doing this, we've been noticing that there is the same pattern is all throughout the Ethiopian canon, where it shows the reasons why God is why he is, where the King James doesn't really explain God as much as the Ethiopian. And we've also learned that the Ethiopian canon and the King James canon are not to be both dismissed, but to be brought together to reveal the entire true story. And although in some books we've found that there are significant differences in the text between the Ethiopian and the King James, we also realize that the tone between the King James and the Ethiopian of God is extremely different. But combined, it brings the full picture. Now, the first movement is not earthly, but heavenly in the book of Job. The adversary questions motive, not morality. And the accusation is very precise. Remove the hedge and worship will fail. Devotion, he claims, is sustained by protection. And what follows unfolds within boundary. Permission is granted, but limits are spoken. As authority does not shift, sovereignty is not transferred. Even trial moves inside restraint. Loss comes quickly and without any explanation. Wealth disappears. Children are buried. Health collapses. Yet the first response is not accusation. It is blessing. It says, and I quote, "Naked I come, naked I return," unquote. The words do not deny pain, they deny entitlement. Worship survives the first assault. And the second wave strips the body, as skin replaces security as the battlefield. Still, life is spared. The limit remains. Then friends arrive with silence before speech. For 7 days, they do not speak. Presence precedes explanation, as that silence is one of the most faithful acts in the book. And when speech begins, certainty replaces compassion. The friends defend justice with rigid symmetry. If suffering exists, sin must exist. And they speak in defense of God, yet misrepresent him. Job then answers without abandoning reverence. He curses the day of his birth, but not the hand of his own creator. His questions are very fierce, but his allegiance does not fracture. Lament rises without rebellion. And as the speeches intensify, human reasoning circles itself. Argument becomes repetition. Assumption becomes doctrine. God remains silent. And when God finally speaks, it's not to explain the wager. It's not to justify the trial. It is to widen vision. It says, and I quote, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Unquote. The question does not humiliate. It recalibrates as scale answers accusation. Creation, therefore, is not chaotic. It is ordered. Seas have boundaries. Stars follow paths. Creatures exist beyond human control. And the world is not simply unstable. And Job's final words do not confess any hidden sin. They confess limited sight. And as hearing becomes seeing, and distance becomes nearness. The friends are then rebuked, but not for defending justice, but for speaking wrongly about God. Certainty without knowledge distorted his character. Yet Job, who questioned, is declared to have spoken rightly. So restoration follows intercession. The one who suffered prays for the ones who accused. Mercy then flows through the wounded. So the book closes without revealing the heavenly dialogue to Job. The test remains unseen as integrity stands without any explanation. Now, Job does not resolve his suffering. It restores his proportion. As God is not volatile, he is vast. And worship that survives loss is no longer transactional. That's what Job is trying to show you. Meaning, it's not just worship, and then I'll come and help. It's not a transaction here. You do this, and then I follow. So the accusation against him fails, and the boundary still remains. But the character of Job does not shift. Now, the scene opens in heaven before anything breaks on earth. Job has not yet suffered. His integrity is already declared. And the narrative establishes righteousness before it introduces any loss. In Job 1:8 through 12, in the Ethiopian canon, it reads, and I quote, "And the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?' Then Satan answers the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has in your hand, only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. That's the Ethiopian canon. Now here's the King James Version, Job 1, 8 through 12. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, and a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, doth Job fear God for naught? Hath not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. Did you catch the differences here? Now, the structure appears in both streams to be nearly identical, but they're not. Job's righteousness is affirmed first. The accusation centers on motive. The hedge is acknowledged. Blessing is visible. And the challenge is issued. Now, the most sensitive phrase appears in the final line of permission. The Ethiopian cadence closes with restriction, foregrounded. Only against him do not stretch out your hand, unquote, Ethiopian. Well, the prohibition stands at the edge of the sentence, not in between it. Boundary is the last word heard before Satan departs. Switching that up makes a big difference. The King James renders, behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself do not forth thine hand. Well, here the phrase is in thy power precedes the restriction. Precedes it. Authority language appears before boundary language. So the meaning in both remains controlled permission, and neither text suggests abdication of sovereignty, yet the order of emphasis shapes tone. One ends on restriction, the other begins with delegated power and then restrains it. The difference is subtle, but it's very audible if you're paying attention. In both, Satan does not act independently. In both of them, he leaves only after permission is spoken. Now, the narrative does not describe negotiation here. It describes Satan's limitation. And what stands firm in both traditions is this: the trial begins inside a boundary that heaven defines. So the scene in the trial of questions in Job 2, 1 through 6, it returns to heaven before the second wave of suffering descends. Earth is already shaken. Job has just lost his children, his wealth, and security. Yet the text records that he did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So integrity stands where protection has fallen. In Job 2, 3 through 6, it reads, this is the Ethiopian canon, and I quote, and the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, and that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. Now, same verse, Job 2, 3 through 6 in the King James Version. See if you can spot the difference. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause? And Satan answered the Lord, he said, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. But put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. So the structure again remains aligned. Job's integrity is reaffirmed. The trial has not exposed hidden corruption. It has confirmed steadfastness. The accusation sharpens from possessions to flesh. And the most sensitive phrase appears in verse 3. The Ethiopian rendering states, quote, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause, unquote. And the King James reads, quote, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause, unquote. Both preserve the central claim that the destruction was without cause in Job. Both acknowledge that the adversary initiated the challenge. Neither suggests that God discovered wrongdoing. But the tonal distinction lies in the verbs. The word incited can carry the sense of provocation or instigation. It frames the adversary as the initiator of the action. Moves, which is a word in the King James, moves, can be heard as influence or prompting. In older English usage, it does not imply control over God, but modern ears may hear persuasion more strongly. Now, in both traditions, however, the sentence remains under divine sovereignty. God is the speaker recounting what occurred. He is not confessing loss of control. He is simply describing that the adversary raised the challenge. And the second permission repeats the same pattern from chapter 1. Here in the Ethiopian, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. And in the King James, behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. Again, here, allowance is granted within a certain boundary. The body may be touched, life may not be taken. The limit is explicit. As the escalation from property to flesh intensifies the trial, but not the authority structure. No new autonomy is granted, and the boundary tightens even as the suffering deepens. And the phrase, without cause, remains central in both texts. Job's suffering is not the result of hidden sin. The narrative insists on this twice, as the trial tests motive and not morality. And what emerges in both streams is not an unstable deity reacting to pressure. It is a sovereign God permitting a defined test. The adversary cannot exceed what is spoken. Even affliction of the body remains measured. And the integrity of Job becomes the counter-argument to that accusation. So protection has been removed. Flesh has been struck, yet worship has not collapsed. So the trial moves forward, the boundary remains. You can't touch any, okay, yep, you touched his house and he didn't sin against me. And now Satan says, well, flesh is flesh. This tells us that Satan can attack our flesh. Thus, disease. God doesn't give us diseases. It's the devil. So after the second assault, the lament of Job in Job 3, the text shifts from heaven to earth and from the narration to poetry. Silence has held for 7 days. Friends have sat without speaking. The grief has matured in quiet before it breaks into language. And the first words of Job after his affliction are not directed at God. They are directed at the day of his birth. So the lament is cosmic before it's theological. In the Ethiopian canon, Job 3, 1-4 reads, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day, and Job answered and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which I was said, a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above. neither let the light shine upon it, unquote. Now, here's King James Version, Job 3, 1 through 4. See if you can spot any differences, especially in tone. After this opened Job his mouth and cursed his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man child conceived. Let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. The opening lines remain nearly identical. The grief is not softened in either stream. The curse is directed toward time itself. And the language does not accuse the Creator. It rejects the moment of entry into existence. So the structure of the lament builds through repetition and negation, to negate it. Day is stripped of light. Night is stripped of joy. Creation imagery is inverted. So the poetry attempts to undo what cannot be undone. Well, the Ethiopian rendering continues. It says, and I quote, let darkness and the shadow of death claim it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. In the King James, it says, and it echoes closely, quote, let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. So the imagery is dense in both of them. Darkness becomes active. Shadow becomes possessive. And the metaphors intensify rather than accuse. So the grief does not say, God has wronged me. It says, I wish I had never entered this order. Or, as most people would say, I wish I was never born. Well, the lament grows broader as it proceeds. In the Ethiopian Witness, it says in Job 3, 11 through 13, and I quote, why did I not die from this womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should nurse? For now I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest. Now, same verse, Job 3, 11 through 13, but King James. Why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees prevent me? Or why the breasts that I should suck? For should I have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept. Then had I been at rest. Again, the tone, there's some tone here. The tone aligns closely. The lament imagines rest, not as annihilation, but as quiet. The word rest appears in both, and the suffering seeks stillness, but not revenge. And as the chapter progresses, Job includes kings, princes, servants, and captives in his mediation. But death levels hierarchy. The lament widens beyond self as it becomes a mediation on human frailty. So the crucial observation is what does not occur. So Job does not curse God. He does not renounce allegiance. He does not declare injustice in heaven. He questions existence under pain, but he does not redefine divine character. So the poetic intensity is very high here in both traditions, as neither stream dilutes the anguish, and neither inserts moral accusation. The grief here is raw, but it remains contained within lament rather than rebellion. So this chapter marks the transition from narrative suffering to dialogical struggle. The friends will respond to his lament with theology. They will defend justice with certainty. The conflict that follows will revolve around interpretation, but not denial of God's existence. So what stands at the end of this lament is not blasphemy, but wounded faith. The man who blessed the name of the Lord in chapter 1 now curses the day of his birth. The tension here is not hypocrisy, it's humanity under pressure. So the text in both traditions preserves this balance. The lament is fierce, yet reverence is not severed. Grief speaks loudly, but covenant language is not abandoned. Thus, the silence is broken, but the debate has actually now began. And let me also make a mention that the King James Version kind of gets a little weird, when it says, It says, well, or why the breasts that I should nurse versus the why the breasts that I should suck. Uh, yeah. I'm sure they could have chosen some better words from that, but for some reason the King James gets a little naughty. Now, the first voice in chapter 4, this is Job 4 through 5. The first voice to answer Job is not heaven, but a friend. It's Eliphaz, or Eliphaz, but I think Eliphaz. Eliphaz speaks very gently at first, but his argument carries a lot of weight. He assumes that suffering follows fault, and the structure of his reasoning is moral symmetry. If pain exists, guilt must exist. In the Ethiopian canon, Job 4, 7 through 9 says, and I quote, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright cut off? Even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed." Here's the same verse in the King James, Job 4, 7 through 9. "Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils are they consumed." So here the logic is nearly identical. Innocence does not perish. Wickedness reaps consequence. Divine breath brings judgment. The pattern Eliphaz describes is not foreign to Scripture. Cause and effect exist in covenant structure. But the sensitivity lies in the phrasing of divine agency, as the Ethiopian reads, "By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed." Well, the King James says it this way, "By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils are they consumed." Now, the image of breath, which we wrote a book about, the breath war, and blast remains in both, but the King James adds the phrase breath of his nostrils, which intensifies anthropomorphic imagery. The Ethiopian retains anger language explicitly, while the King James emphasizes physical imagery. So neither text presents random destruction, but both present consequence tied to moral action, as the difference is tonal rather than structural. And Eliphaz continues with the vision narrative. It says, and I quote in Ethiopian Job 4, 17 through 19, "Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? Behold, he puts no trust in his servants, and his angels he charges with error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust?" Now here's the same verse in King James, Job 4, 17 through 19. "Shall mortal man be more just than God? Shall a man be more pure than his maker? Behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust?" Well, the argument intensifies. Human limitation is emphasized. Angels themselves are not beyond scrutiny. The tone in both traditions underscores divine transcendence. But the question becomes whether Eliphaz's certainty aligns with divine speech later in the book, as he insists that affliction follows wrongdoing, and he encourages Job to seek correction. In the Ethiopian Witness, Job 5, 17 through 18, it says, and I quote, "Behold, happy is the man whom God corrects, therefore does not despise the chastening of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he binds up. He strikes, but his hands make whole." Here's the King James Version, Job 5, 17 through 18, I quote, "Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth, therefore despisest not thou the chastening of the Almighty. For he maketh sore and bindeth up, he woundeth, and his hands make whole." So the structure actually remains aligned as wounding and healing are paired. Correction is framed as mercy. The theology of Eliphaz presents is not heretical, but it is incomplete. The tension in this section is not between two textual traditions. It is between lived reality and rigid doctrine. Eliphaz applies general covenant principle to a specific case without evidence of guilt. The Ethiopian and King James streams do not diverge significantly here. The difference lies in cadence and imagery rather than doctrine. The moral logic stands the same in both. But what matters for the broader investigation is this. The friend speaks with confidence about how God operates, but later God will rebuke him for speaking wrongly. So the misrepresentation does not lie in quoting general truths. It lies in applying them without knowledge of the unseen context. And the debate, it keeps deepening. Certainty has entered the conversation. And then the question is no longer whether Job suffers, but why? So his friends defend justice, and Job defends integrity, and heaven still remains silent. Job's defense of the strain of perception, this is in Job 6 through 7. Well, Job answers Eliphaz without abandoning reverence. His words are sharp, but they are not godless. The pain is now voiced directly, and the weight of grief presses against theology. In the Ethiopian Witness, it says, and I quote, Job 6, 2 through 4. Oh, that my grief were fully weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances together. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea, therefore my words are swallowed up. For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poisons of them drinks up my spirit, the terrors of God are set in array against me. Now here's that same in the King James Version, Job 6, 2 through 4. Oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed and my calamity laid in the balances together! Exclamation point. For now it would be heavier than the sand of the sea, therefore my words are swallowed up. For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poison wherewith drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. So the phrasing, again, remains closely aligned. Grief is measured by weight. Suffering is described as arrows. The metaphors intensify, yet the structure does not fracture. So the sensitive element lies in how divine agency is heard. Job attributes the arrows to the Almighty. He speaks from experience, but not from doctrinal precision. The language is experiential, but not analytical. He then turns toward the inadequacy of his friends. In the Ethiopian Witness, Job 6:14, it says, I quote, to him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Here's that same verse in the King James, Job 6:14, I quote, to him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend, but he forsaketh the fear of the Almighty. So the Ethiopian rendering reads as exhortation toward compassion, but the King James compresses the sentence in a way that can sound accusatory. The difference is subtle, but in both, Job laments the absence of mercy from those who came to comfort him. So the focus shifts again in chapter 7 as Job addresses God directly. Here's the Ethiopian Witness, and I quote, Job 7:17 through 19. Robert Curtison is here. What's up, pal? So Ethiopian Witness says in Job 7:17 through 19, what is man that you should magnify him, and that you should set your heart upon him, and that you should visit him every morning and test him every moment? How long will you not look away from me, nor let me alone till I swallow my saliva? Well, King James says it this way. This is Job 7:17 through 19. I quote, what is man? What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more. Whoa, 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 whoa. Sorry. What is man? What is man that thou shouldest magnify him, and that thou shouldest set thine heart upon him, and that thou shouldest visit him every morning and try him every moment? How long wilt thou not depart from me, nor let me alone till I swallow down my spittle? So the language here is nearly identical. The tone is bold, but not blasphemous. Job does not deny God's sovereignty. He questions the intensity of divine attention. And the phrase, set your heart upon him, remains consistent in both. The testing language appears in both. The complaint is really about relentless scrutiny and not divine injustice. So the emotional force of these chapters lies in proximity. Job speaks directly to God without intermediaries, and his questions are urgent, but they do not renounce covenant allegiance. And the Ethiopian King James renderings track very closely throughout these passages. There is no structural divergence of doctrine, as the intensity comes from metaphor and not from textual expansion or omission. So the central tension emerges more clearly. Job experiences suffering and attributes it to divine allowance. The friends interpret suffering as punishment. So the gap between perception and unseen reality widens here. And what stands firm in both traditions is that Job continues to speak to God, not away from him. Lament remains relational. Even complaint presumes presence. And the debate moves forward. Theology has been challenged by experience. The question now presses deeper. Does suffering prove guilt, or does it expose the limits of human understanding? Well, the debate between Job and his friends continues through cycles of speech. Arguments deepen. Certainty hardens. Repetition begins to circle. And this is where poetic transmission becomes significant. As from this point forward, measurable differences begin to appear between manuscript traditions. And certain speeches in the Greek Septuagint stream are shorter than in the Masoretic Hebrew stream that underlies the King James. So lines are actually condensed. Phrases are sometimes compressed. And in some places, metaphors are streamlined. So the question here is not whether something is missing, but the question is whether compression alters meaning or merely density. One example appears in the middle cycles of Job's response. In King James, it says, Job 12:6, I quote, "The tabernacles of robbers prosper, and that they provoke God are secure." And they that provoke God are secure, into whose hand God bringeth abundantly. Well, the Masoretic-based English here contains a paradox. Those who provoke God appear secure. And the phrasing can be heard as ironic or accusatory, depending on the cadence. And in several Septuagint-based renderings of this verse, the wording actually tightens, as the emphasis falls more clearly on perceived injustice rather than divine provisioning language. So the sentence may read with less rhetorical ambiguity, focusing on prosperity of the wicked without implying that God actively brings abundance into their hand. So the theological point remains the same. Job observes moral disorder in the world, yet compression removes some of the tension in phrasing. So another sensitive location actually appears in Job 13:15. Here's the King James Version. It says, I quote, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, but I will remain mine own ways before him." Well, this line carried centuries of devotional weight. It portrays unwavering trust even under threat. In some Septuagint-based renderings, the line reads differently, closer to, "If he should slay me, I will not wait, but I will argue my ways before him." Well, the difference here is not small. One reads as defiant trust. The other reads as desperate determination to plead one's case. Those are big differences. Now, the variation is actually rooted in Hebrew textual ambiguity and how it was understood in different manuscripts streams. The divergence does not produce two different gods. It actually produces two different tonal hearings of Job's posture. In one, Job models surrendered faith. In another, Job models relentless confrontation within covenant. But both actually remain relational. Neither abandons God. So this is where the investigation becomes very precise. Remember, we're investigating the difference between the Ethiopian canon and the King James. And in the beginning, we were trying to look for the angry God versus the merciful God. And we've been finding that both canons support each other. And it's the Ethiopian canon that actually gives just a little bit more detail to a more merciful God, where the King James, we don't know why. We can only speculate, Rome did it on purpose, or the Vatican, or the Catholic Church to create this angry God for control, but we don't have proof. But they are different in tone. So when poetic lines are compressed or rendered differently, the density of metaphor then shifts. The intensity of language can either expand or tighten. Now, the Ethiopian stream, flowing through Septuagint influence, may preserve shorter or streamlined poetic movement in certain places. But the King James reflected the Mosaic tradition that often retains the fuller Hebrew poetic expansion. So, in this way, the Ethiopian had less information, and the Hebrew, or the King James, had more information, which is bizarre because I wasn't really looking for that. I was looking for the King James to be the bad Bible and the Ethiopian to be the good Bible. But what we're finding is they're both spot on, but they actually they fulfill each other. I don't know why, but that's what we're finding. So length in a sentence alone does not equal authority. Density alone does not equal distortion. So the central question is whether theological content changes here. And across these dialogue sections, the structure of the debate remains intact in both traditions. Job asserts innocence, the friends assert moral causality. Job insists on divine encounter. So no manuscript stream removes the central tension here. And no tradition deletes the accusation of the friends. And no stream erases Job's insistence on hearing from God. So what shifts is just poetic contour. Some speeches feel more extended in the Masoretic tradition, while some others feel more direct in the Septuagint stream. But the argument still remains. The tone breathes differently. So this is the first place in the canon where measurable structure differences begin to surface more clearly than in the narrative books that we went through in the past. And this is not evidence of theological manipulation, however, but it is evidence of how ancient poetry traveled through transmission lines. So the weight of Job does not depend on length of speech. It depends on whether divine character remains consistent through accusation and lament. So far, in both traditions, that character remains intact. The compression does not erase sovereignty. The expansion does not introduce volatility. The debate, though, intensifies, and human reasoning reaches its limits. The new voice will soon enter before heaven then speaks. Now, after the 3 cycles of debate fall silent, this is in Job 32 through 37, where Elihu and the intensification of divine defense comes in. A new voice rises. Elihu is younger. He has listened without speaking. His anger is directed both at Job and at the friends. He believes Job has justified himself rather than God, and he believes the friends have failed to answer him. So the entrance of Elihu, is marked clearly in both traditions. In the Ethiopian, it says, and I quote, Job 32, 2 through 3. Then the anger of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, burned. His anger was aroused against Job because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends, his anger was aroused because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Well, here's that same verse in the King James, Job 32, 2 through 3, and I quote, Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. So the wording here tracks very closely, and the repetition of anger is deliberate. in both. Elihu believes the debate has dishonored God. His speech is framed as corrective. And the difference between streams here is not structural theology, but density. In some Septuagint-based traditions, Elihu's speeches are slightly more compressed. In the Masoretic tradition reflected in the King James, the speeches feel extended and layered. The content, however, remains the same. God is just, suffering can be instructive, and divine ways exceed human understanding. So Elihu presents a key theological pivot. Here's the Ethiopian witness in Job 33, 14 through 16, I quote, "For God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men. Then he opens the ears of men and seals their instruction." Here's the same verse in King James. "For God speaketh once, yea, twice, yet man perceiveth it not. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep is falleth upon men, then he openeth the ears of men and sealeth their instruction." Now, the phrasing differs slightly in cadence. The Ethiopian reads, "may speak in one way or in another." Now, the King James reads, "speaketh once, yea, twice." So both communicate multiplicity of divine communication, but one emphasizes method, but the other emphasizes frequency. So Elihu argues that suffering can function as restraint rather than punishment. And the Ethiopian witness, here's Job 33, 18 through 19, and I quote, "He keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed." Here's the King James version of that. "He keepeth his soul from the pit," or "he keepeth back his soul from the pit, and his life from perishing by the sword. He is chastened also with pain upon his bed." So the theology aligns with both streams. Affliction may serve preservation, but the argument reframes suffering as discipline rather than retribution. Elihu intensifies divine transcendence as he approaches the end of his speech. In the Ethiopian canon, Job 37, 23 through 24 says, I quote, "As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power, in judgment, and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Therefore, men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart." Now, here's the King James. I read and I quote, same verse. "Touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment, and in plenty of justice he will not afflict. Men do, therefore, fear him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart." So the Ethiopian reads, "he does not oppress," but the King James reads, "he will not afflict." The distinction here is subtle. Afflict may sound more direct in modern English. Oppress frames injustice or frames injustice more explicitly. So both defend divine righteousness, however. So the structural role of Elihu is significant. He does not receive direct rebuke later in the text. Elihu also does not receive divine endorsement. His speech stands between human reasoning and divine revelation. So across both traditions, Elihu functions as escalation. He sharpens the defense of God's justice. He prepares the ground for the whirlwind without fully resolving the tension. So the textual differences in this section are minimal in the doctrine, and compression and expansion affect the cadence more than theology. So the central claims remain consistent. God speaks in ways unseen. Suffering remains rather than condemn, or suffering may restrain rather than condemn, and divine justice is not arbitrary. So the debate has reached its limit. Human voices have exhausted themselves, and the next voice will not argue, it will question. Here, in the part of Job 38 where the whirlwind speeches and the scale of sovereignty are introduced, the argument ends when God speaks. No explanation is offered for the heavenly dialogue. No justification is given for the trial. The voice that answers comes from the whirlwind, and it does not defend policy. It reveals scale. And the Ethiopian witness, Job 38, 1-4 says, I quote, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding.'" Now here's that same phrase of Job in the King James. "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding." So the opening words align very closely. The challenge here is not emotional, it's epistemological. And so the question is not, why did you doubt me? But what did you know of creation? What do you know of creation? The whirlwind introduces interrogation, but not accusation. The command differs slightly in cadence here in both Ethiopian and King James. The Ethiopian reads, "Prepare yourself like a man," and the King James reads, "Gird up thy loins like a man." So one sounds preparatory and the other sounds martial. Both signal readiness, but the tone shifts with phrasing. But the substance still remains firm. The speech unfolds through a series of creation questions. The Ethiopian witness says, and I quote Job 38, 8-11, see the Ethiopian, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, 'This far you may come, but no further,' and here your proud waves must stop." Here's that same verse in King James. "Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it," swaddling band, "and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and yet hitherto thou shalt come, but no further, and there shall thy proud waves be stayed." So here the imagery remains consistent. The sea is contained, boundaries are fixed, bars are set. The theological emphasis is clear in both traditions. Chaos does not govern creation. Order does. So the difference in phrasing appears in fixed my limit versus break up for it my decreed place. So the Ethiopian foreground actually limits. The King James emphasizes decree. So both communicate sovereignty here, but one highlights boundary while the other highlights authority structure. So they complement each other. And as the speech continues, attention moves from cosmology to creatures. Ethiopian Job 40, 15-7 says, I quote, "Look now at Behemoth, which I made along with you. He eat grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit." Here's the King James Version. I quote, "Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in his navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. His sinews of his stones are wrapped together." Sounds like a dinosaur to me. The imagery is vivid in both. The King James retains older anatomical phrasing. The Ethiopian rendered may smooth certain archaic expressions here. And the creature is presented as immense and beyond human control. Leviathan then follows in chapter 41. Ethiopian. Job 41, 10-11 says, I quote, "No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. So King James says, same verse, none is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me? Who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. So the rhetorical move becomes very explicit. If no one can stand before Leviathan, who can stand before the one who made him? Sovereignty is not defensive, it's absolute. So across these chapters, the tonal differences between streams are minimally compared to earlier poetic compression. The speeches are structurally intact, the sequence of questions remains, the scale of imagery holds. The divine response does not accuse Job of secret sin, and it does not reveal the wager. It does not even defend justice through explanation. It actually establishes order through magnitude. So the central theme here in both traditions is boundary. The sea is bounded, the morning has limits, the constellations follow courses, creatures move within design. So the God who permitted the trial governs creation with restraint and measure. Nothing in these speeches suggests volatility. Nothing suggests instability. The whirlwind does not introduce anger. It introduces proportion. And the debate about suffering dissolves under the weight of creation's architecture. Human reasoning cannot map what it did not build. Please tell me you're listening. I know this stuff is very dry. But if you want a real full understanding of God, this is one of the biggest revelations you've heard probably within weeks. I'm going to read it again. The whirlwind does not introduce anger, it introduces proportion. The debate about suffering, especially Job's suffering, it dissolves under the weight of creation's architecture. Human reasoning cannot map what it did not build. So what this is saying is, hey, and in both canons, you're sitting here trying to understand God and all of the crap that happens in this world, yet you can't even face a creature and take it down. If you can't even take down one of his creatures, how can you possibly take down or even understand God? So the final word before Job answers is not condemnation. It's revelation through scale, how big God is. And it also says, everything is mine. When you try to compare you to me, first compare you to my biggest creature I've ever created, which was Leviathan. And if you can't compare Leviathan to you in equal measure, then don't bother trying to compare against me. I'm bigger than all of this. And I have a plan. I have reason. I understand what's going on. And everything will be okay. So then the divine rebuke and the correction of misrepresentation comes into play here in Job 42. As after the whirlwind subsides and Job answers with humility, the narrative then shifts from revelation to judgment. Not against the sufferer, but against the speakers who claim certainty. In the Ethiopian canon, Job 47, 7-8 says, I quote, "And so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz, the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, and my servant Job has." Here's that same verse in the King James. "And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz, Eliphaz, the Temanite. My wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends, for ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept, lest I deal with you after your folly, if that ye have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. So here the rebuke is unmistakable in both traditions. The wrath is declared. The charge is specific. The friends have not spoken rightly about God. So the phrase appears twice in both streams. You have not spoken of me what is right. So the repetition here emphasizes misrepresentation rather than mere error. Their theology was precise in form, but wrong in application. And the tone of divine anger is present, yet it is directed not at doubt, but at distortion. The Ethiopian reads, I will accept him lest I deal with you according to your folly. And the King James reads, lest I deal with you after your folly. The sense remains aligned, but judgment is restrained through intercession. And the most striking detail in this section is the elevation of Job, the one who lamented, the one who questioned, the one who demanded an audience. He is called my servant repeatedly. And in both traditions, the phrase is spoken 4 times in this brief exchange. The title restores covenant dignity. The friends defended God with certainty, but Job wrestled with God in pain. In pain. And the rebuke does not fall on the one who asked questions. It falls on the ones who misrepresented divine character. Meaning they spoke for God and they didn't understand the Torah. So the requirement of sacrifice reinforces the seriousness of their error. Theology that misstates God requires atonement. Yet mercy enters immediately. Because God then says, he follows, my servant Job shall pray for you. So the sufferer becomes the intercessor between the friends and Eliphaz. And the wounded becomes the mediator. And restoration begins not with wealth, but with prayer. So across both traditions, there is no divergence in doctrine here. The wrath language is present in each, and the acceptance language is present in each, and the intercessory structure is identical. The distinction is not between an angry God and a merciful God. It is between misapplied certainty and humbled understanding. As the divine speech clarifies the central conflict of the book, God was not defending himself against Job. He was simply correcting those who claimed to defend him. So what follows will not be compensation for endurance. It will be restoration through a relationship. Thus, the trial has ended and the accusation has failed. Then the servants remain. So in part 47 or Job 42, the restoration, intercession, and then the shape of the ending here. The restoration begins not when God speaks, but when Job prays. In the Ethiopian Witness, Job 42:10 says, I quote, and the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Here's a King James version of that. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Also, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Big differences here. But it's not contradictory. The Ethiopian reads, restored Job's losses. The King James reads, turned the captivity of Job. Well, turned the captivity is an older covenant idiom. It often is used for national restoration. It carries a redemptive historical resonance. Restored losses sounds more direct and personal. Both, however, communicate reversal. One leans covenantal in tone and the other leans experiential. So the restoration is explicitly tied to intercession. The prayer for the friends precedes the doubling, and mercy flows through the one who suffered. Thus, the narrative continues with multiplication. In the Ethiopian Witness, it says, and I quote, this is Job 42, 12 through 13. Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. For he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. That's a lot. It's like everything in my town. Well, we don't have oxen or donkeys that I know of. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Here's the King James Version, Job 42, 12 through 13. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels. Oh, that's right, we don't have camels here. And 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 she-asses. Never knew they called it that. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. So the numbers here align. The doubling is literal in livestock. The children are again 7 sons and 3 daughters. So the narrative does not describe children as doubled in the same arithmetic way as animals. And the restoration preserves symmetry without turning offspring into inventory. So the text then lingers on the daughters. Ethiopian says, Job 42, 14 through 15, I quote. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, that's where we get Aunt Jemima from, the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapuk. In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. Here's that same, but in the King James. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen Hapuk. And in all of the land were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job. And their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. So the inheritance details remains in both traditions. The daughters receive portion alongside sons. The ending quietly expands dignity beyond convention. And beauty is noted, but inheritance is emphasized. So the closing line seals the account. In Ethiopian, Job 42, 16 through 17, it reads, and I quote, After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. Here's the same verse in King James. After this lived Job 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died being old and full of days. So the language remains stable. Longevity returns. Generational continuity is restored. And the phrase full of days echoes patriarchal endings in Genesis. And the restoration closes not with explanation, but with completeness. And this also gives us a clue. If we are as understanding of God and his nature and character and his word as Job was, we could live longer than 120. In fact, we could live just as long as Job did, 140 years. So no manuscript stream inserts a speech where God apologizes. None reopens the heavenly wager. None explains the unseen conversation to Job. The ending is relational, but it's not analytical. As captivity turned, loss restored, intercession honored, generations extended. So the God who permitted the test remains sovereign as the close, or at the close. And the servant who endured remains faithful. The friends who misrepresented received mercy through the one that they wounded, which means he prayed for his neighbor. Come on now. And across both traditions, the conclusion does not alter divine character. The differences lie in idiom and cadence, but not doctrine. So the book ends without resolving every philosophical question about suffering, but it does resolve allegiance, as integrity survives loss. Misrepresentation is corrected. Mercy is restored. Life then continues. And Job closes not with argument, but with fullness. So to conclude, Job does not introduce a new God. It removes the illusions that human certainty builds around him. From the heavenly council to the final restoration, the structure holds in both traditions. Permission is bounded, suffering is limited, accusation is exposed, and misrepresentation is corrected. However, integrity survives. So where differences appear between Ethiopian stream and the King James, they are primarily matters of poetic density and cadence. Some speeches compress, some phrases intensify, but certain idioms shift emphasis, yet the theological spine does not fracture. The God who permits the trial remains sovereign. The adversary never exceeds boundary. The sufferer never abandons covenant, and the friends are corrected for speaking wrongly. So the most significant variation observed lies not in doctrine, but in tone. At points, the King James foregrounds decree and power language before restraint. At points, the Ethiopian rendering foregrounds boundary and relational phrasing. And these differences can shape perception, especially in poetic passages. But neither tradition presents volatility. Neither removes divine stability. So Job's lament does not become blasphemy in either stream. God's whirlwind does not become rage in either stream either. Restoration does not become transaction in either stream. And the accusation at the beginning of the book was that worship depends on reward. Well, the ending proves otherwise. Integrity remains when blessing disappears. Intercession flows from the wounded. Mercy closes what accusation opened. Well, in the earlier books, we've established covenant history, and Job establishes covenant endurance. Narrative gave way to poetry, and poetry tested perception, yet the central portrait remains consistent. Guys, God is not unstable under scrutiny. Human understanding is. So the comparison across traditions reveals nuance, not contradiction. Compression and expansion alter rhythm, but not sovereignty. And the investigation, therefore, strengthens rather than destabilizes the text, as Job stands as a hinge in the canon. It confronts suffering without dissolving divine character, and it rebukes certainty without condemning lament. It also restores without explaining every mystery. So here, the trial ends, the servant stands, and the character of God remains intact. This has been Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Tune in tomorrow night when we go to part 17 of the next book. God bless you, God thank you, God keep you, and we will see you guys mañana.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.